Hi, sophomores. Okay, so here's my interpretation of this poem. And while normally I won't tell you that something in poetry, like an interpretation of poetry, can be wrong, it can be. There are things you can say that there's just no evidence for, just like with literature. So while I will accept a lot of, and I'm not saying for your assignment you need to be worried about that. For your assignment, I'll accept whatever ideas you came across. It's mostly a completion grade. But there are, if we were talking in class and we were going through certain possible interpretations of this poem, every interpretation that you would give me, I would ask you why you feel that way, and I would ask you to point to textual evidence for such. And if you couldn't come up with anything, then I would be less likely to accept your interpretation. Okay? So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that poetry is very subjective, but there are things that we can use to ground ourselves in the reality of the poem, and that is coming from the text. It needs to come from the text that you get your proof and your ideas, and I'll show you what I mean. So, Aunt Jennifer's tigers prance across a screen. A screen in this case, you don't know this really until you get down to this here where it says her fingers fluttering through the wool. But a screen is referring to crafting, like a mesh screen that you might be crafting in and out of, like an embroidery or something along those lines. So her tigers prance across a screen most likely means that she is working on some sort of cross-stitching or embroidery or something along those lines, and she's sewing tigers and making it look like they're prancing across that area that she's working on. Bright topaz denizens of a world of green. Topaz is most typically orange, so that's going to be representing the tigers. And denizens means like citizens or people who live. And in the world of the green, that would mean probably that either the background of the cross-stitching or embroidery is green, or just simply that tigers live in the forest, and so they live in a world of green. She's represented that in her work as well. And it says, they do not fear the men beneath the tree. They pace in sleek, chivalric certainty. That line at this point in the poem is a little confusing because I don't know, it's almost like I wasn't even thinking about men for them to be afraid of, so it's interesting that you would bring that up. But I do know that they do not fear the men, which kind of says to me that there might be somebody who does. They pace in sleek, chivalric certainty. Chivalry meaning like, normally we talk about chivalry as polite and kind and gentlemanly. I'm going to do a quick Google search here, chivalric, see if there's anything I'm missing. It just says relating to chivalry or chivalrous, so that works with what I said. Okay, I don't know why I told you that because you can see my screen. Okay, the next stanza says, Aunt Jennifer's finger fluttering through her wool. That was what helped me figure out that she was doing some sort of sewing. Find even the ivory needle hard to pull. Now that's interesting because, and it might be crochet or knitting, or I'm not really entirely sure what craft we're talking about here, but we have an ivory needle. A needle is not usually difficult to pull, so why is it that she might be having difficulty? I'm thinking, is she shaking, maybe? The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. So now I have an uncle being mentioned. He doesn't have a name, which is interesting. Maybe he doesn't have a name because he's no longer alive. Maybe he doesn't have a name because he's not worthy of a name. The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band. Normally wedding bands do not weigh a ton, so I don't think the poet means literally that she's being weighed down by this rack of a wedding band. I think that there's a reason that she might find her wedding band to bring heaviness upon her. She's finding it hard to pull, and it might even be that she's literally having difficulty pulling it, or it's just adding to this idea that the wedding band is making life difficult for her. My two reigning theories as I'm reading this are either that the uncle is dead, and so she's having difficulty going on in life without him, and so that's the massive weight. But normally massive weight, it just seems more negative to me than that. So my next theory is that uncle is maybe abusive, maybe not such a nice man, and so she's afraid of him, and so their marriage is a very intense weight for her because he's not good to her, perhaps. Okay, third and final stanza. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. Now that it says her terrified hands, I'm definitely leaning towards more of like an abusive sort of situation here, because you wouldn't normally have terrified hands just in mourning, right? M-O-U-R-N, mourning. I like the use of still ringed with the ordeals she was mastered by, because her hand, of course, is still going to have the ring on it, but at the same time, her hands will lie there, and looking at her, you will still almost like see the difficulty that she went through in her life. But the tigers that she makes will still go on prancing, proud and unafraid. So that lets me believe that her crafting is almost like an outlet or a coping mechanism for her to purposefully craft an animal that is unafraid of man, right? And now I go back to, they do not fear the men beneath the tree, but maybe Aunt Jennifer fears a particular man, right? Beneath her tree, if you will. Where she is. And we can presume that if the tigers are in the tree and the men are underneath the tree, it's because the tigers are hiding from the men. Or if they're not afraid of it, maybe they don't have to because they're up in the trees, right? But she doesn't have that luxury, but she makes these tigers and these panels of crafts. Panels are often used for quilting as well, so it might be quilting that we're talking about here. But she makes them to help reassure her, to help her cope with whatever it is that she's going through with her husband, right? Okay. So that was my interpretation. In the end, I come down to this idea of an abusive husband who makes his wife, who is Aunt Jennifer's, life very difficult. And she is, and I actually don't know when this poem was written, but I can imagine that it doesn't really matter what time period you live in when you're dealing with an abusive husband. People handle that kind of thing very differently, and this is how she handles it. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that it might be that you got something close to that, and that's neat. It might be that you were totally on a different train of thought, and that's okay too. But I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless.